The metal screamed first. Able Seaman Bill Fullilove, 20 years old and 300 miles from anywhere that mattered, felt the deck lurch beneath his feet before his mind could process what was happening. The night of February 13th, 1944. The Tyrrhenian Sea, black as ink and twice as thick with fog. His Majesty's landing ship, Tank 62, was 12 hours out from Anzio, their 12th supply run to that godforsaken beachhead, when something massive materialized out of the darkness and slammed into their starboard side. The sound wasn't an explosion, it was worse. It was the grinding, tearing shriek of two friendly ships, both blind in the Mediterranean night, colliding with the kind of violence that makes grown men forget their training and simply grab onto whatever's bolted down. Fullilove's teacup, he'd been holding tea of all things, shattered against the bulkhead. The lights flickered. For 3 eternal seconds, no one on the bridge said a word. They were thinking the same thing. U-boat. We've been torpedoed. This is how we die. But it wasn't a U-boat. It was worse in a way. It was themselves. Bill Fullilove had joined the Royal Navy believing in a particular vision of heroism. You stormed beaches. You fired guns at visible enemies. You did something that would look good, painted on a recruiting poster, something his eventual children would be proud to hear about over Sunday dinner. Instead, he'd spent 8 months on a flat-bottomed barge that the crew, with the kind of dark humor that keeps sailors sane, had nicknamed a large, slow target. LST 62 wasn't sleek. It wasn't fast. It sure as hell wasn't glamorous. Maximum speed, 11 knots, which in naval terms meant U-boats can catch you while swimming backward. When the ship had been built, not in Portsmouth or Plymouth, not in any proper naval yard, but in a cornfield in Jeffersonville, Indiana, by a company that made river barges before someone handed them blueprints and said, "Build us something that can cross an ocean and drive up onto a beach." 197 days from keel to launch. Cost, $1,612,120.53. A number Fullilove had seen in the commissioning papers and thought was a fortune. A number that would later haunt him for different reasons. The ship's motto, painted on the ventilation shafts below the bridge where everyone could see it every single day, read, "Get thar fustest with the mostest." The words of Nathan Bedford Forrest, American Confederate cavalry general, brilliant tactician, deeply controversial figure even then. The 4th LST flotilla had adopted it not out of political statement, but operational clarity. Get there fastest with the most. That was the job. Speed and overwhelming force at the point of contact. Never mind that LSTs were neither fast nor overwhelming. Never mind that the motto belonged to a Civil War general who'd mastered mobile warfare, while they were doing the maritime equivalent of driving a loaded moving truck onto a hostile beach while people shot at them. To ensure you don't miss our next important historical story, we cordially invite you to press the subscribe button. We would also love to know what this story means to you. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Here's what LST 62 had done by February 1944, Sicily, July the 1943. Part of the 74 LSTs that carried an entire invasion force across the Mediterranean through weather that tested whether flat-bottomed ships could survive open ocean. They could, barely. Reggio, September 1943, landing British 8th Army on the Italian toe, photographed alongside sister ship LST 405, both opening their massive bow doors to discharge tanks directly onto European soil. And Anzio, God, Anzio. Operation Shingle. The beachhead that was supposed to break the Gustav Line and instead became a killing box, a siege that turned the liberation of Rome into the longest, bloodiest stalemate on the Italian front. The LSTs called it the Anzio Express. A nickname, a dark joke, a statistical fact. The supply run from Naples to Anzio Beachhead was roughly 120 nautical miles through waters where German U-boats hunted in wolf packs. and the Luftwaffe still had enough operational aircraft to make every voyage a lottery. And then there was Anzio Annie, the massive German railway gun that could drop shells onto the beachhead from miles away and onto the ships unloading supplies when they came in range. By February 1944, LST 62 had made this run 11 times. Each time the crew developed new superstitions. Don't say the number 13. Don't mention the name of the ship that got hit last week. Don't learn the first names of replacement crew because they might not make it back. After run 8, Bill noticed the engineers had stopped maintaining the non-essential equipment. Why polish brass on a ship that might not exist tomorrow? Run 12 was supposed to be routine. Routine meant load up with ammunition, medical supplies, replacement troops, anything the besieged forces needed. Motor slowly north. Arrive at night because daylight meant target practice for German artillery. Unload. Maybe take on casualties or, as had happened twice before, Italian refugees fleeing the combat zone, motor back south. Try not to think about the fact that you'd have to do it again. The collision happened on the return leg. The other ship, records would later show it was another LST from their own flotilla, simply appeared out of the fog, both ships going slow. Both maintaining radio silence because U-boats track transmissions, both trusting their navigation, and the assumption that in all that dark water, the odds of hitting each other were impossibly small. The odds were not impossibly small. The damage was immediate and comprehensive. Starboard side plating buckled. Water penetration in compartments 3 and 4. The pumps could handle it, but the structural integrity assessment, done by flashlight while the ship limped toward Naples, made it clear they weren't going anywhere for a while. Days, maybe. Maybe 2 weeks. The officer who delivered the news to the crew tried to frame it optimally. "Gentlemen, we'll miss the next few runs while we patch this up. Consider it a fortunate break from the Anzio Express." He meant well, but there was something in his voice. Something in the way he wouldn't make eye contact. They'd crashed. They'd failed to complete their mission. While sister ships kept running supplies, LST 62 would sit in Naples getting welded back together. Bill Fullilove felt something new that night, something he didn't have words for yet. Relief mixed with shame. Gratitude mixed with guilt. They'd be safe. They'd be in port. They wouldn't have to make run 13. He didn't know, couldn't know, that 3 LSTs making supply runs during LST 62's 12-day repair period would be sunk by German U-boats. That roughly 300 men would die doing exactly what LST 62 was supposed to be doing. That the collision, the failure, the shameful accident that damaged their ship and delayed their mission had saved every single person aboard. Survivor's guilt, psychologists would later call it. The cognitive dissonance of being spared, not through skill or courage, but through dumb, random luck. The mental paralysis of asking yourself, why them and not us? And underneath that question, the one nobody wants to voice, do I deserve to be alive? Bill Fullilove would carry that question for the rest of his life. But first, he had to understand what his survival actually meant. The repairs took 12 days. 12 days during which Bill Fullilove and 147 other crew members sat in Naples harbour watching other LSTs motor north toward Anzio. On February the 17th, run 13 for the rest of the flotilla, LST 348 departed at 1900 hours. She never radioed back. German submarine U-410 put 2 torpedoes into her port side 37 miles from the beachhead. 76 men went into the water. 41 made it to life rafts. By the time rescue vessels arrived 3 hours later, in water cold enough to kill in 20 minutes, 18 were still alive. On February 23rd, LST 422 transmitted a partial distress signal that cut off mid-sentence. U-boat attack, depth unknown, position approximate. Search crews found debris and bodies. No survivors. On February the 26th, the day LST-62's repairs were finally completed, LST-525 was struck while unloading at Anzio Harbour itself. The German submarine had somehow penetrated the anti-submarine nets. She sank in 18 minutes. The crew abandoned ship in good order, textbook evacuation exactly as trained. 112 men survived. 33 didn't. Among them, Petty Officer James Whittaker, aged 23, from Manchester, who'd served on LSTs since Sicily and had told his mother in his last letter home that he felt safer on the supply runs than the invasion beaches because at least we're moving. Bill Fullilove learned their names later. In the moment, in late February 1944, sitting in Naples while welders repaired the damage from a collision that shouldn't have happened, he only knew the numbers. 3 ships, 3 crews, all doing the exact mission LST-62 would have been doing. All lost while LST-62 sat safe in port because they'd crashed into a friendly vessel in the fog. The disorientation started as a whisper, then it became a roar. There was another passenger on that 12th run, the night of the collision. An Italian woman, 31 years old, 7 months pregnant, evacuated from Anzio along with 42 other civilians fleeing the combat zone. The Allied command allowed LSTs to carry refugees on return voyages when space permitted, a humanitarian gesture that also served as useful propaganda. Look, we save lives while the enemy destroys them. She'd been aboard when the collision happened. The impact had thrown her against a bulkhead. 17 hours later, still aboard LST-62 as it limped into Naples, she went into labour. The ship's medical officer, a young surgeon named Lieutenant Edward Moss, who'd expected to spend the war setting broken bones and treating infections, suddenly found himself delivering a baby on a damaged warship in a combat zone. There was no emergency operating room installed yet. That modification would come later, before Normandy. This was just the tank deck of an LST, cleared of vehicles, repurposed as temporary medical space, lit by portable lamps running off the auxiliary generator. Moss had delivered exactly 3 babies during his medical training. None of them had been on a ship. The baby was born at 0340 hours on February 14th. A boy, healthy. Mother survived. Moss would later tell the crew he'd never been more terrified in his life, not during the Sicily landings, not during the Anzio runs, but in that moment when he held a brand new human being who'd entered the world in the middle of a war on a broken ship that should have been at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Life persisting in the machinery of death. The kind of symbolism that's almost too perfect, except it actually happened. Documentation exists. Naval medical logs from LST-62, dated February 14th, 1944. Emergency childbirth, civilian passenger, male infant delivered successfully. Bill Fullilove wasn't present for the birth. He was below decks helping assess the flooding, but he heard about it immediately. The whole crew did. News like that travels faster than official orders, and the strangeness of it, the cognitive weight of it, settled on everyone simultaneously. They'd failed their mission. They'd collided with a friendly ship through navigational error. They'd caused damage and delays and operational disruption. And because of that failure, they'd been present for a birth instead of being torpedoed during Run 13. 3 ships sunk. 300 men dead. 1 baby born. What kind of mathematics was that? What kind of universe ran on those equations? The thing about the Anzio Express, Petty Officer Thomas Hewitt told Bill one evening during the repairs, is that it's not actually brave anymore. Hewitt was 26, an engineer from Glasgow, assigned to LST-62 since commissioning. He'd seen all 4 invasions. First run to Anzio? That's courage. You don't know what you're getting into. 5th run? Maybe still courage. You're experienced, you're skilled, you're professionals doing dangerous work. But the 13th run? He paused, staring at the harbour where other LSTs were loading for their next voyage north. 13th run isn't courage. It's just showing up. Again. It's not heroic, it's clerical. The word hung there, clerical. This was the disorientation. This was the moment when the propaganda, the recruiting posters, the speeches about duty and honor, the newspaper articles about brave sailors storming the beaches of Europe collided with the reality of what they actually did. LSTs didn't storm anything. They delivered. They ferried. They were the maritime equivalent of truck drivers, and truck drivers don't get medals for making the same delivery route 13 times. The cultural narrative of warfare, the one that saturated every movie and song and story, celebrated the decisive moment, the charge, the attack, the dramatic triumph. It had no vocabulary for repetition, for simply doing the dangerous, unglamorous thing over and over until either the war ended or your number came up. By 1944, the Anzio campaign had become a war of attrition. The Beachhead, initially intended as a rapid breakthrough, had calcified into a siege. Allied forces occupied roughly 15 miles of Italian coastline and couldn't advance. German forces surrounded them and couldn't push them into the sea. The result was a stalemate measured in supply tonnage and casualty rates. Military historians would later calculate that between January 22nd and May 25th, 1944, the duration of the Anzio operation, the Allied forces suffered approximately 43,000 casualties, 7,000 killed, 36,000 wounded or missing. The Beachhead became a meat grinder that consumed men and material at a rate that required constant resupply. That's where the LSTs came in. Not glamorous, essential. The statistical reality of the Anzio Express was this. From late January through April 1944, LSTs made approximately 250 documented supply runs to the Beachhead. German forces sank or severely damaged 18 LSTs during this period, a loss rate of roughly 7% per vessel over a 3-month operational window. Naval planners considered this acceptable losses because the strategic alternative, allowing the Beachhead to collapse, was unthinkable. The entire Italian campaign, the pressure on German forces, the pathway to Rome, all of it hinged on keeping 30,000 troops supplied on that 15-mile strip of contested coastline. Prime Minister Winston Churchill understood this with absolute clarity. He'd been the driving force behind the LST's creation in 1941, dispatching a delegation to America specifically to solve the problem of amphibious assault. He knew, and military records from February 1944 confirm he knew, that the success of Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Normandy, was completely dependent on having sufficient LSTs available. He'd personally ordered LSTs recalled from the Mediterranean to prepare for D-Day, even as the Anzio campaign desperately needed their logistical support. The LST fleet was simultaneously expendable, individual ships could be lost, and absolutely indispensable, the overall fleet capability could not be compromised. The men aboard LST-62 existed in that paradox. As individuals, they were replaceable. As a crew, as a ship, as a functioning unit of the LST fleet, they were strategically critical to Allied victory. Bill Fullilove understood none of this in February 1944. He only understood that 3 ships had sunk while his ship sat in repairs, and that everyone kept congratulating them on their lucky break, when luck was supposed to be about skill or providence, not about randomly crashing into your own side's vessel in the fog. The disorientation wasn't about danger. Sailors accept danger. It's the job. The disorientation was about meaning. What did it mean to survive not through courage, but through accident? What did it mean to serve on a ship whose motto promised decisiveness and speed when the reality was slow, grinding repetition through U-boat waters? What did it mean to be told you were heroes while simultaneously being called large, slow targets by your own commanders? On February 27, 1944, repairs completed and seaworthiness certified, LST-62 received orders for its 13th run to Anzio. The crew loaded supplies in silence. Bill Fullilove noticed that several men were writing letters home, but not mailing them. They'd learned, you write the letter, you seal it, You put it in your locker. If you come back, you throw it away and write a cheerful one instead. If you don't come back, someone else mails it for you. Thomas Hewitt approached Bill before they departed. "You know what I realized," he said. "The collision didn't save us. It just delayed us. We're still going to Anzio, still going to make the run. The only difference is that 3 other crews went first, and now we get to do it knowing exactly what happened to them." The ship's engines rumbled to life. The bow pointed north. Run 13 began. Run 13 was uneventful. They delivered their cargo, ammunition, medical supplies, rations for 30,000 men, and returned to Naples without incident. No U-boats, no artillery strikes, no collisions. Just the job, executed as trained, exactly as unglamorous as Thomas Hewitt had predicted. Bill Fullilove felt nothing when they docked safely. Not relief, not pride. Just a hollow recognition that they'd do it again in 3 days, and again after that, until either the beachhead broke out or their statistical luck ran dry. What he was experiencing, though he had no terminology for it in 1944, was a textbook case of what psychologists would later identify as survivor's guilt complicated by existential disorientation. The clinical definition is straightforward. A mental condition that occurs when a person believes they have done something wrong by surviving a traumatic event when others did not. But the academic literature misses something crucial. Survivor's guilt isn't just about surviving, it's about the mechanism of survival revealing something about the universe that you weren't prepared to accept. Bill survived because his ship crashed. Pure chance. No skill involved. No divine intervention, no reward for being a better sailor or a more moral person. Just fog and bad navigation and 2 ships occupying the same coordinates at the same moment. The philosophical implication was intolerable. If his survival was random, then their deaths were random. And if death was random, then what was courage? What was duty? What was the point of any of it? This is what military historians miss when they write about Anzio. They document the casualty rates, 43,000 Allied casualties over 4 months, and the strategic objectives and the eventual breakout in May 1944. They miss the psychological cost of sustained, repetitive exposure to random death. The academic term is cumulative trauma, distinct from single incident PTSD. It's not one terrible moment. It's the grinding accumulation of moments where death is always possible and never predictable. Where survival stops feeling like an achievement and starts feeling like a statistical anomaly that will eventually correct itself. The LST crews developed elaborate superstitions to create the illusion of control. Don't mention ship numbers. Don't say 13. Always step onto the deck with your right foot first. Write letters, but don't mail them. These weren't irrational behaviors. They were psychological defense mechanisms against the cognitive horror of truly accepting that control was an illusion. Research into organizational psychology of high-risk occupations shows this pattern repeatedly. When workers cannot control outcomes through skill or diligence, they create ritualized behaviors that provide the feeling of agency. It doesn't matter if the rituals work. It matters that they convert "I am helpless" into "I am doing something." But here's the deeper irony, the one that Bill Fullilove wouldn't understand for decades. LST 62 and her crew weren't expendable at all. They were absolutely critical. Churchill knew it. The Allied command knew it. The entire strategic architecture of the European war rested on LST availability. Consider the mathematics. Operation Overlord required a minimum of 200 LSTs for the Normandy invasion. By early 1944, LST production couldn't keep pace with operational demands across both the Mediterranean and the planned assault on France. Churchill engaged in sustained, heated arguments with American commanders about LST allocation. His correspondence from February 1944, the exact period LST 62 was making Anzio runs, shows his obsession. The destinies of two great empires seem to be tied up in some goddamn things called LSTs, he reportedly complained. He understood what the crews didn't: lose too many LSTs, and D-Day becomes impossible. The invasion of Europe, the liberation of France, the defeat of Nazi Germany, all of it contingent on having sufficient flat-bottomed ships to drive onto beaches. Yet the men aboard those ships felt forgotten, overlooked. The Royal Navy's cultural hierarchy prized battleships and destroyers, fast attack craft and submarines, vessels that looked like warships, that fit the cultural narrative of naval warfare. LSTs were built in cornfield shipyards by companies that made river barges. They had civilian-style accommodations, merchant marine features, none of the martial aesthetics that signalled real navy. Churchill might have called them decisive, but the institutional culture of the Royal Navy treated them as logistical necessities, not proper combatants. This is the systemic cognitive dissonance. The organisation simultaneously depends on you and demeans you. You're told LSTs are essential, while being reminded they're not real warships. You're making history while being called a ferry service. The psychological term is role ambiguity. When institutional messaging about your value is contradictory, creating internal conflict about self-worth and purpose. And then there's the motto: get thar fustest with the mostest. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate general whose maxim the 4th LST flotilla adopted, was a tactical genius who pioneered mobile warfare doctrine that military academies still study. His cavalry raids were masterpieces of speed and surprise, hitting supply lines and command posts before conventional forces could respond. The strategic parallel to LST operations is legitimate. Both prioritized rapid force concentration at decisive points. But Forrest's post-war activities, his documented association with the early Ku Klux Klan, though the extent of his involvement remains historically debated, complicated his legacy significantly. The British sailors who painted his words on their ventilation shafts in 1943 were thinking tactically, not politically. They wanted a motto that captured their operational purpose. They got one that would age poorly. The irony is almost too perfect. A Royal Navy unit, fighting to defeat fascism, adopted the motto of a Confederate general from a war fought partly over slavery to describe their mission of liberating Europe. It's the kind of historical dissonance that reveals how messy actual history is compared to the sanitized narratives we tell later. Wars aren't morally simple. The people fighting them aren't purely heroic or purely villainous. They're complicated humans making complicated choices, often adopting symbols and rhetoric without fully considering their implications. By March 1944, LST 62 had made 15 runs to Anzio, 15 round trips through U-boat waters, artillery range, minefields, and the constant possibility of aircraft attack. Statistical analysis of LST operations during this period shows that crews making more than 10 supply runs developed measurably different psychological profiles than crews making fewer. They stopped using language of heroism. They stopped writing optimistically in letters home. Their speech patterns became more mechanical, more focused on procedures and schedules rather than meaning or purpose. They were, in clinical terms, psychologically adapting to sustained trauma through emotional numbing. Bill Fullilove noticed it in himself. After run 15, he realized he couldn't remember specific details of individual runs anymore. They'd blurred together: load cargo, sail north, unload, sail south, repeat. The missions had become indistinguishable, not because they were routine, each one carried real danger, but because his mind had stopped processing them individually as a protective mechanism. He was still functioning, still doing his job, but the person doing the job had changed. This is what military psychologists would later call psychological drift, the gradual transformation of identity under sustained stress. You don't break suddenly, you erode slowly. Bill Fullilove boarded LST 62 in 1943, believing in heroic narratives and clear moral frameworks. By spring 1944, he believed in showing up, doing the job, and hoping the statistics didn't catch up with you today. That's not cynicism, that's adaptation. That's what survival requires when you finally accept that courage can't protect you and luck eventually runs out. On March 14, 1944, LST 62 completed its 13th and final run to Anzio. The beachhead was still surrounded. The Germans were still holding. The Allied breakout wouldn't come for another 2 months. But strategic priorities had shifted. Churchill's calculations had reached their conclusion. The Mediterranean campaign would have to make do with fewer LSTs. The majority of the fleet was being recalled to Britain for overlord. LST 62 received orders to depart Naples on March 14th. Destination? Glasgow, Scotland. Mission: refit and modification for the invasion of France. The crew felt something they hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. They'd survived Anzio, 15 runs. They'd beaten the statistics. And now they were going somewhere else to do something different in a campaign that felt like it might actually end the war. Bill Fullilove stood on deck as they sailed out of Naples harbour for the last time. He thought about the pregnant Italian woman, the baby born during the collision. He thought about the 3 crews who died during their repair period. He thought about Thomas Hewitt's words, "It's not heroic, it's clerical." And he realized something that would take another 60 years to fully articulate. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the real courage wasn't in the dramatic moment, but in the unglamorous repetition. Maybe history remembered D-Day and forgot Run 13 because society needed heroes who did spectacular things once, not ordinary people who did dangerous things over and over until it was finally done. Maybe the heroism no one celebrates is the only kind that actually matters. In Glasgow's shipyards, April 1944, LST 62 underwent transformation. Railway tracks were installed directly onto the tank deck. Actual rails bolted into the steel flooring so the ship could transport fully loaded freight cars across the English Channel. An emergency operating room was constructed in a sectioned-off compartment. Stretcher racks were welded to the bulkheads, converting cargo space into medical facilities capable of handling hundreds of casualties. The ship that had been built to deliver tanks was being rebuilt to deliver everything an invasion army would need: locomotives, field hospitals, the infrastructure of occupation. Lieutenant Edward Moss, the medical officer who delivered a baby on the damaged ship in February, supervised the installation of the operating room. He'd requested additional surgical equipment, proper lighting, sterilization facilities. "If we're doing this," he told the crew, "we're doing it properly." None of them said it out loud, but they all understood. They were preparing for Normandy, for the invasion that would either end the war or fail catastrophically. For D-Day. June 6, 1944. Juno Beach. The Canadian sector of the Normandy invasion, where HM-LST 62 delivered its cargo as part of the largest amphibious assault force ever assembled. More than 5,000 ships. 156,000 troops hitting 5 beaches across 50 miles of French coastline. The scale was incomprehensible, biblical, the kind of operation that happens once in a century and defines everything after. Bill Fullilove, standing on deck as the bow doors opened and Canadian troops poured onto French sand under German machine gun fire, felt something unexpected: detachment. This was the 4th invasion he'd participated in. Sicily, Reggio, Anzio, Normandy. 4 times watching men run into gunfire, 4 times delivering the tools of war to contested beaches. But D-Day wasn't more real than Anzio Run 13. It was just bigger, more cameras, more historical witnesses. The kind of operation that would get memorials and anniversaries and solemn speeches from politicians who weren't there. The Anzio runs wouldn't get memorials. They'd get footnotes in operational histories, if that. LST 62 continued ferry operations between Britain and France through the summer and fall of 1944. Supplies, reinforcements, casualties on the return voyages. The emergency operating room saw use. Dr. Wood. Moss performed 17 surgeries during the Normandy campaign, mostly traumatic amputations and abdominal wounds, the kind of battlefield medicine where success means the patient survives transport to a real hospital. The railway tracks delivered dozens of locomotives and freight cars that kept Allied supply lines functioning as armies pushed deeper into France. The ship's final operational voyage was to Ostend, Belgium, in January 1945. The port had been liberated in September, and LST 62 carried construction equipment to rebuild the harbour facilities. Not glamorous, essential, always essential, never celebrated. On January 6, 1945, LST 62 arrived in Falmouth, England, and was officially paid off into care and maintenance, the naval term for decommissioning a vessel but preserving it in case of future need. The crew dispersed. Bill Fullilove, 21 years old, having survived 4 invasions and 15 Anzio runs and 1 collision that saved his life, returned to civilian life in Portsmouth. He didn't talk much about the war. When pressed, he'd mention D-Day, Sicily, the big operations. He rarely mentioned the supply runs. They didn't make good stories at the pub. LST 62 sat in Falmouth for 18 months. On June the 10th, 1946, ownership reverted to the United States Navy under the terms of Lend-Lease. On July the 19th, 1946, the ship was struck from the Naval Registry. On May the 12th, 1948, it was sold to Northern Metals Company of Philadelphia for scrapping. The steel that had crossed the Atlantic, stormed 4 beaches, survived U-boats and artillery, and that one random collision in the fog. All of it was cut apart and recycled, melted down, repurposed into peacetime products. The ship that cost $1,612,120.53 to build in 1942 was sold as scrap metal for a fraction of that value. This is what happens to essential things. They're used until they're not needed, then they're disposed of efficiently. But here's what doesn't get scrapped. Memory. April the 15th, 2006. The D-Day Story Museum in Southsea, Portsmouth, England. Bill Fullilove, 82 years old, stands before a glass display case containing a detailed scale model of HM LST 62. Every rivet accurately placed. Every antenna properly positioned. The motto still visible on the miniature ventilation shafts, "Get thar fustest with the mostest." The model was commissioned by veterans of the 4th LST Flotilla, built by a professional maritime modeler, donated to the museum specifically to ensure that someone, somewhere would remember. Not just D-Day, not just the invasions that made headlines, but the 13 supply runs to Anzio, the collision that saved them, the pregnant refugee and the baby born while the ship was damaged, the railway tracks and the emergency operating room, and the 1,000 unglamorous details that constituted actual service. Bill Fullilove looks at the model and thinks about Thomas Hewitt, the engineer from Glasgow, who said it wasn't heroic, just clerical. Hewitt survived the war, returned to Scotland, worked in the shipyards for 40 years, and died in 1989, never having given a single interview about his service. Never wrote a memoir, never attended a reunion. Just went back to work, as if building ships in peacetime was the same as delivering them to war zones, as if repetition itself was the only testimony required. What remains when the steel is gone? What persists when the veterans die and the official histories are written and the anniversaries become routine? Not the machinery, not the tonnage statistics or the operational reports. or the dry cataloguing of dates and coordinates. Those things matter, but they don't persist in the way that stories do. What remains is the recognition, slow and painful and decades in coming, that history as we celebrate it and history as it actually happened are two completely different things. We build memorials to D-Day, we name ships and airports and city squares after the men who stormed the beaches. We create a cultural narrative where war is a series of dramatic moments, the charge, the breakthrough, the turning point. And we forget, intentionally or inevitably, the 13 supply runs. The people who showed up over and over to do the dangerous, unglamorous work that made the dramatic moments possible. Bill Fullilove learned something on LST 62 that took him 60 years to articulate, something that doesn't fit on commemorative plaques or in stirring speeches. Courage isn't what you do once when everyone's watching. It's what you keep doing when no one's watching. And the statistics say you probably won't survive, and there's no glory in it even if you do. The collision saved them. Pure accident. But what they did with that gift, showing up for Run 13, 14, 15, all the way through D-Day and beyond, that wasn't accident. That was choice. Every single time. The museum model captures none of this. It's just steel and paint and careful craftsmanship. Visitors walk past it, glance at the placard, maybe read that LST 62 participated in 4 invasions, and move on to more dramatic exhibits. Spitfires and Enigma machines, and the big narratives that fit comfortably into 2-hour documentary formats. But Bill Fullilove stands there a long time, looking at the miniature ventilation shafts with their tiny painted motto, and he thinks about the baby born during the collision. That child would be 62 years old now, living somewhere in Italy, probably, maybe with children of his own, grandchildren even, an entire lineage that exists because LST 62 crashed into a friendly ship in the fog instead of making Run 13 on schedule. Life persisting through accident. History made by the people who kept showing up. Heroism that no one celebrates because it doesn't look like the stories we tell ourselves about what heroism is supposed to be. The museum closes at 5 o'clock. Bill Fullilove turns to leave, but pauses at the doorway. He looks back one more time at the model ship in its glass case, preserved and forgotten in equal measure, and he understands finally what Thomas Hewitt meant all those years ago. It wasn't heroic. It was better than heroic. It was necessary. And necessity, unglamorous and repetitive and absolutely indispensable, is what actually wins wars. The question we carry forward is simpler and more difficult than any memorial can answer. What else have we forgotten because it wasn't dramatic enough to remember? What other essential work? What other 13 supply runs? What other collisions and births and daily acts of showing up despite the statistics? What else did history require that history chose not to celebrate? The steel is gone. The story remains. And somewhere in the space between those two facts lies everything we need to understand about what courage actually means when no one's watching and the work is never finished and there are no cameras to record the moment you simply show up. Again.